Sure.
Okay.
Do you want to just check and see if anybody has any questions for you guys?
Yeah,
And then we'll,
that sounds
I'll
good.
Oh, like you
swap
set it
the,
Yeah.
Okay.
I'll-
Yeah, so do you guys have any sort of questions regarding immigration that we can sort of throw in? Yeah.
Well, one is the travel ban for refugees and immigrants. I heard the other day that of the 7 countries identified in the travel ban, the U.S. has already or is in the process of starting to bomb 5 of them. Well, that goes along with what you said about if the U.S. has been there, they're coming here. So I'm thinking that there needs to be a way for people to make this more visible or more, people need to know more about how this cycle operates, that refugees don't just come here just for the economic benefits. Sometimes they come here just to flee war.
Yeah, Syria.
Syria's good example.
Totally. And I think, isn't it today or yesterday, it was the anniversary of the Holocaust? So it's so fitting that we're actually sort of having that conversation today.
We don't have the facts and figures and so forth that you presented, and you have to live with this every day. How can you stand it?
You teach this stuff, dude.
You hope somebody's listening. You do what you can to try to get the ear of policymakers. You try to figure out ways to present this in a manner that they will react to.
Yes. I'm wondering if people who have papers that say that they've been vetted and they are here, if those people are in danger as well as all of the people you were talking about.
Sure. I think a lot of individuals feel very vulnerable right now. So you have a category, you can be undocumented, but then you can be documented.
Right.
And that means that you can be a legal permanent resident, which means you have a green card. So some of these executive orders actually rope in people who have green cards. They make them suspicious, despite the fact that they themselves have been heavily vetted to become permanent residents, to have that green card.
Right.
So I think a lot of those individuals are now reluctant to, for example, take on food stamps, some of those social services, in part because they're afraid that depending on what happens in the next 100 days, that might make them targets for deportation or to have that sort of taken away.
Even though they have
Yes.
all the paperwork that they need.
Yes.
They also might be married to someone who's undocumented or have a sibling. I mean, so mixed status households, when you start to look at the ways that one undocumented person, they have kids, they probably have citizen children, they may have a spouse who's documented, and so even if you're documented, you are probably intimately bound up with someone who isn't.
Exactly. And I think we actually have a number of students in that position, but I'd imagine that there are a number of people here inside Syracuse who are in one of these mixed status families.
Yeah.
I mean, this is very, very typical, and much more so than, like not everybody's undocumented in one household. It's usually some combination.
Right.
So,
I work with children at the White Branch Library whose families have been vetted,
yeah.
and so they're here legally. But they could be deported.
Yeah.
Let's put your historian's hat back on.
Sure.
This country's always been not welcoming to immigrant populations throughout our history. What factors kind of move the needle back so that we become less frightened, less worried? It kind of falls away from the top of the people's mindsets. Are there trends that have happened where you can look and say, okay, so when these things happen, people are not as scared as they were before?
Sure.
Historically.
You want to cover that one?
So there's a strong connection between when the economy bottoms out and when we become more nativist. The other thing is time. So if we were 100 years ago, the thing we would be talking about is the Catholic menace, right? I say that to my students and they just laugh because it doesn't make any sense. And so sometimes it's time, but it's also the composition of immigrant flows changed in 1965 when we had the Hart-Celler Act, and we started bringing in immigrants much more from Latin America and Asia, and their ability to claim white identity is very different from an Irish immigrant or from an Italian immigrant or someone who's Greek, who from generation to generation can move closer to whiteness in all sorts of ways, and that the sort of current composition of the immigrant population is very different. So there is a real question of, is this kind of going to be the norm moving forward?
Yeah. And I think the one thing to also sort of consider from a historical standpoint is that immigrants are scapegoats, and they're so easy. They're such easy targets. And because, you know, in part because most of them don't necessarily have the wherewithal or the connections or the ability to sort of publicly come out and sort of put up a defense against this sort of hate mongering. We're easy targets.
A lot of them don't have votes too,
Yes,
so.
definitely.
You mentioned earlier that more Americans are emigrating to Mexico. Who are these Americans? What kind of Americans are they?
There are all sorts. There are a lot of
Retirees?
your cohort.
Cheaper to live down there.
Yeah,
So
I
that-
mean, I don't know if you guys heard, but the Mexican economy, like right now, the dollar's unbelievably strong.
So they're not people of Mexican descent, that's bad
There
thing?
are a lot of snowbirds.
Yeah. And it's all sorts of combinations. I mean, it's amazing. Yeah. I think there was somebody else who had their hand up over in this. Oh, yeah, sorry.
Yeah, so this is more maybe a statement, but maybe you can answer it. In my view, I think we have a major problem, and it's actually nothing to talk about. It's an education crisis, an education and fact crisis, where students can know, first of all, students are coming out, well, they're going to school, they may not be getting information in a way that's, I think, legitimate. In some places they're, you know, in the schools, there's pushing towards this, you know, teaching the controversy, right? So we have, in my view, we have an education crisis that's happening at the primary and secondary level, not so much at the university level. And also, what's becoming more and more apparent is what's truth, and be able to weed out truth versus fiction. And the blind eye that a large segment of the population is turning to. So I think that's something that really, maybe it's a talk in itself,
No, I
but
think
it's a
you're-
huge problem.
It's
Because
hard-
without the support of the people behind these executive orders, it would never happen.
Yeah, but I think one of the things that Jamie sort of mentioned in some of the previous teach-ins that we've done, and I have actually sort of learned about this, is that the likelihood of you sort of supporting these sorts of executive orders and these sorts of ideas, these anti-immigrant ideas, they come from communities without immigrants. So if you're sort of exposed to kind of that diverse environment, and maybe I should actually let Jamie speak to this, because you've done such a good job, like I've actually learned from her, people.
No, if you try to measure sort of anti-immigrant sentiment, ideas about how restrictive you would like immigration policy to be, you typically find higher levels of anti-immigrant sentiment in if you do it at the county scale, in counties that have much lower immigrant populations. But you're right, I mean, we're in a post-truth era, and that it becomes really difficult when I talk about this and someone says, yeah, but you can't trust the census. The census, so when we talk about, well, you can't trust, so, you know, if you can't trust these things that we viewed as kind of ground truth empirical facts, there's a real question of how you move forward.
One of our very own members of our congregation, he's an adjunct professor at SU. He's going to be doing a talk at Liverpool Library on fake news.
Oh, wow, that's great.
On May 11th at 7 p.m. So,
Wait, May 11th, where?
7 p.m., Liverpool Library, fake news, talk about fake news.
Yeah, you alluded to the executive orders that have been issued so far. This really wasn't your topic, but does either or both of you combined have any ballpark figure of how many executive orders Trump has issued since taking office? I think he signed one like in his first hour of office. I mean, the thing I'm reading this question is, I'm not
It's more than any U.S. president in modern history.
figures. Because every time Obama issued one, the Republicans and their press pretty much crucified him for it. But the rate's got to be much, much
It
more.
is.
No one's saying, why is no one saying that?
I guess they are, yeah. But I think, you know, at this point, you know, it's funny, it's a little exhausting in the sense that I think they did, especially at the beginning, because it was like, holy cow, but now it's sort of become pro forma. It's sort of normalized. It's like, we all sort of expect that it's gonna come.
I mean, one thing in terms of like, how do we move the needle in a post-truth era? This doesn't work on a large scale, but I did some research a few years ago in Alabama, which in 2012 had the most anti-immigrant state legislation of anywhere in the country. And one of the things that became clear is some of the people who supported that were not ready to see what it meant when immigrants started moving out of their trailer park. And when immigrants started holding yard sales and selling all their things and moving out, and those signs made this anti-immigrant sentiment really personal. right? So when your neighbor is selling all of her stuff and moving, or is no longer willing to leave the house, one of the things we heard was, this just feels really personal, right? In a way that saying, oh, get rid of the illegals, we just, laws are important, we need to protect our borders, that's easy to say. But when you see those human costs, and in terms of thinking about what we can do, is constantly remind people about those human costs. That this is not a decision that you can make in the abstract and suddenly the border is secure. This is a decision that tears families apart, that leaves kids without parents, that makes people have to sell their stuff. And those human costs, we often find, can move that needle on the kind of interpersonal scale.
About the cost of the wall, I was with some other people meeting with Senator Schumer's staff person today, and they were saying that the Democrats definitely do not want to be seen as shutting down the government. Just a little warning about that. I understand also some members of Congress are against, some Republican members of Congress that are along the border there are against that, and I was wondering what the reason is for that. Because
all of border economies are dependent on flows of people, resources, money, and goods across the border. So those cities will not function. If you have like a Game of Thrones wall, if you have this big wall that nobody can cross, it will shut down those economies in places like El Paso.
Yeah. And, I brought up the eminent domain thing, but right now it's hugely controversial because there's some of these ranches, like for example in Texas, that will be on the wrong side of the wall. Or, like literally their property's been seized. So from that perspective. And then likewise, I'm not 100% sure about the policymakers, but the environmental cost of sort of like, sort of from migration patterns and for birds and insects and all that sort of stuff, it can be pretty catastrophic to say the least. Especially if you're pretty close to the wall, to have something like that all of a sudden kind of come up in the way.
Some of those territories are also sovereign Native American territory. And I don't think that Trump has thought through, like, you can't just go in and claim those spaces.
Do they want to make it like the Israeli wall? That's a pretty imposing wall.
Yeah, that's the one.
How about the Berlin Wall?
Also, cattle drink from the Rio Grande of ranchers.
Exactly. So, we'll sort of see.
We should move on to an equally optimistic topic.
I'm probably like you all. One of the reasons I love doing this, I love learning from my colleagues, and Gladys and Jamie, the presentation is great, and makes me want to be a student again. Too many interests at a time. So thank you so much for having us here tonight. It's funny, growing up going to Catholic schools, I thought the Catholic friends were always the nuts. But it's something different. So tonight I'm going to talk about healthcare in the Trump era. And while there has been a lot of heat and light, not in good ways with immigration, there's been a lot of talk, but not as much action in healthcare. I was driving into work today, and I was listening to the radio, and President Trump tweeted that he's going to send healthcare and save the government from shutdown this week. And then immediately afterwards, they said they talked to Paul Ryan's office. He's like, yeah, we don't have healthcare on the agenda this week. So I'm not sure what the president's agenda is, but my agenda this week does not include healthcare. It's everything we have just to keep the government up and running this week. So I doubt healthcare makes it on the agenda this week. So in order to explain where we are today, I want to go back to a pre-ACA, pre-Obamacare era and explain what the healthcare industry coverage in the United States looked like before the Affordable Care Act, how the Affordable Care Act changed healthcare insurance in the United States, and then some of the proposals that are coming out of the Trump administration and the Republican Congress. So this chart I have in front of all of us gives an idea about how Americans under 65 received health care insurance in 2008, the year of President Obama's first election. One thing to note is that the United States, like most industrial countries has a mix of private and public health care insurance, right? If you're over 65, if you're a US veteran, if you're poor, then you receive, if you're a government employee, right, if you're a US Congress member, you receive federally funded government health care insurance, right? But if you're not in those designated categories, you, for the most part, were on the private market. So that's one thing to know. Another is that the vast majority of Americans under 65, again, receive their health care insurance through their employer or through their partners or spouses' employer. Now, a couple of things to note about this. One is that, and this is what made the Affordable Care Act so difficult and why it took 2 years to pass, and why the idea of something to replace it could be passed in a matter of weeks was a fantasy to begin with, is that the Affordable Care Act was meant to fix certain elements of what you see in front of you without messing with the employer side of the equation, which was 60% of how people under 65 were covered, and a lot of people are satisfied with their health care insurance, right? So it was, you know, kind of trying to stack angels on a pinhead to try to reform the individual market, help people who did not have health care insurance without messing too much or at all with the 61% of people who receive their health care insurance through the employer side. So that's one thing to note about ACA. Another thing to note is that the 61% you see in front of you, that is not an even distribution of the American population under 65. There are some Americans who are more likely than others to be offered health care insurance in 2008. If you were wealthier, if you were white collar, if you worked in a large corporation, and a lot of the characteristics I just named identify more with white workers than it did with workers of color. And if you had those characteristics, you were more likely to be offered health care insurance from your employer. If you were part-time, if you were in the service sector, if you were female, if you were in a blue-collar job that was non-union, you were less likely to be offered health care insurance from your employer, which meant that you had to go to the individual market you see there and pay higher prices because you did not have the benefit of buying as a group. Right? So that's one thing to note, is that the people who are in the 60% do not look like the people who are in the individual market or who are on Medicaid or who did not have any health insurance. And if you looked at the trend lines up into 2008, the categories that were increasing were people who were on Medicaid and people who had no health care insurance at all. And one that was decreasing was employer-based, as people were either losing union jobs and then going to the service sector, or entering the marketplace into mom-and-pop jobs or service sector jobs. They were entering occupations that did not offer health care. So, for example, in 2000, that number was 66%. You see by 2001, it was going down to 61%. And the concerns that President Obama and the Democrats tried to address were price equality in the individual markets, and also to drastically lower this number right here, the amount of people who do not have health insurance. So what did they try to do? Yes?
So I have a question about why anybody was concerned about the no health insurance, the people without health insurance. Was that because they felt compassionate that everyone ought to have it, or was that because it's too expensive to have people be uninsured?
I think both were motivating concerns. So one thing I wrote a book in which I looked at funding differences between Republicans and Democrats for social programs, including health care. And in looking at the rhetoric of the parties of the past 3 decades, one thing that's clear is that when Democratic leaders talked about health care, they talked about it as a right of citizenship And when Republican leaders over the past 30 years talked about healthcare, they talked about it as a market or an industry. So I believe that a lot of the Democratic leadership who came into power in 2006 with the kind of sweeps in the House and Senate and with President Obama winning in 2008 were motivated by the idea that, listen, every citizen, regardless of their status, should have access to healthcare, should have healthcare. But also, large elements of Obamacare, which I'll get into some but not all, was meant to bend the healthcare cost curve. And one of the things that was driving up the healthcare cost curve was people using the emergency room and people having a lack of access to healthcare insurance, whose costs were not eaten by the benevolent healthcare insurance companies, right? They were passed on to people who did have healthcare insurance in the form of higher premiums and copays. So both of those, I think, were at issue as part of the motivating force behind trying to get this number down. So what did the Affordable Care Act do? Now, it was a very large bill. It included a host of different elements. Some of the things I don't get here in this slide are the attempts to bend the healthcare cost curve and also to kind of give incentives for people to go into areas such as general practitioners for medicine. But I'm going to focus on a couple of elements of the ACA. One is the extension of healthcare insurance, and next, how they tried to pay for it. So there were a lot of different mechanisms that were put in place to try to take a chunk out of that 17% you saw on the previous slide. So one is that some people did not have healthcare insurance because they had pre-existing conditions and they literally could not afford any of the healthcare insurance plans that they were eligible for. So one is that they had as a component, you couldn't deny people based upon pre-existing conditions. Another they found is that a lot of young people who were entering into these service jobs they were not offered healthcare and decided not to get healthcare, who were in their 20s. So they tried to get a little bit of that group by allowing them to stay on their parents' coverage until 26, a lot of our students. Now, here's what got lost in a lot of the coverage of the ACA, but is now a very large element in the reform efforts. The majority of people who gained health insurance through the ACA gained it through an expansion of Medicaid. It wasn't the individual mandate, it wasn't the state markets. Over half of the people who gained health insurance gained it through an expansion of who was eligible for Medicaid. Now, prior to ACA, so you see where it was raised to. So it was raised to 138% of FPL, stands for the federal poverty line. So for an individual, that's up to $16,000. Prior to the passage of ACA, first of all, a lot of individuals were not